Today, thought I'd test my son out a little bit because he's heard these disclaimers like all his life practically. And so I wanted to see if he can actually do the disclaimers for me. So Chris, if you can bring up, yeah, there you go. So
Okay, I haven't seen these.
Yeah, I kind of made it a little bit mysterious as to what I was trying to say. So the first premise, when you think about God and Oscar, one of the first disclaimers I have is not a fan of parties. So, well, what do you think that means?
I would assume that that means the thing that you often say, which is that you're not really talking about God speaking through like the party of the Oscars or the ceremony, the fancy dresses and the patting each other on the back.
Or slapping each other on the face, yeah.
Yes. But it's more about the films themselves that God is speaking through. And the party is just a way to gather those films into some sort of way to elevate them in their voice.
That's exactly right. All right, you got number one. Number two?
Don't show me the money. Okay, let me think about it. I would assume that this might mean the thing about the fact that most Oscar movies don't make much money.
That's correct. Yeah, so usually movies who are up for Oscars, they're usually passion projects. So you have some artist who really wants to make a film, a filmmaker, or maybe it's an actor, and so they come together to make this film because they want to say something. So it's less about commerce, and anytime you take commerce out of the equation, usually you are doing art for art's sake, and when that happens, usually art for art's sake usually has much more meaning, and unfortunately nobody goes and sees these films. But we had a couple of movies this year that were...
Top Gun and Avatar made a bunch of money.
Yeah, and you were the one who actually pointed out that it was still passion projects. So it was Tom Cruise's passion project and James
Cameron's passion project.
So there's a little bit of, that's the flavor of the Oscars, is that you're watching things that have meaning. So one of the things that frustrates me is that all we do is talk about a party and slap each other on the back and all this kind of stuff. But in reality, why aren't we looking at the meaning behind these movies when they're made in such a way that people made them for that very purpose? So that is one of the reasons I think that the Oscars are important, but also that God is speaking through them because it's almost like the artists are prophets, if that makes sense. All right, next one up.
Supernatural timing. Okay, I would think that this has something to do with the fact that all these movies are made at different times, greenlit at different times, and take many, many years to be made, but then they all coalesce into this one year, where often there's sort of a consistent theme between them, even though they were all made in separate years. I mean, even in like 2021, after the pandemic, there were all these films that had been delayed multiple years because of the pandemic, and yet they still came together in common themes, which was fascinating.
That's exactly right. So, I made a movie and it took me 8 years to make my movie, right? And so
Avatar 2 took 13 years?
13 years, Avatar 2. So the conceptions of movies are way, way back here in history. Then they make them, then they distribute them, and then they're hopefully nominated for an Oscar. And so the fact that this palette, I call it a palette of parables, that all of a sudden this palette of parables comes together in such a way that if you look at the common themes, that's what I feel like where God is in it all, is that it's just supernatural that these films come together at this specific time. And we'll give you some examples of that in just a second. So, all right, next up or the last one. Yeah.
You're speaking my language. I don't know what you mean by this one.
Oh, well, to me, this is like foundational. Like, I don't know if you might be feeling like, okay, theologically, Brian, like where do you stand on like God and Oscars and stuff like that? And for me, I've always believed that God is a God of motion pictures. He loves imagery, he loves metaphor. And so if you think of the Old Testament prophets, their lives, their stories were actually metaphor and imagery for what would be Jesus. And then if you look at Jesus's life, he came to show us the Father, and so he was a motion picture of God. And then, of course, he talked in parables, which were motion pictures. They weren't just, stories, or they were images, like you remember his stories by the motion pictures playing in your head. And then, of course, I think our lives are supposed to be, motion pictures for, showing people God, So to me, I just believe this is his language. And why would he not use people who speak his language really well? So if you spoke Spanish and someone was speaking Spanish in a way that really was impactful, then wouldn't you listen if that was the language God spoke, if that makes sense?